Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and I want to welcome you all to today's program, Voices of the Diaspora, organized by the Asian American Pacific Islander Arts Network, ARTNOIR, and the Here and There Collective. These three organizations have collaborated to invite artists, art historians, and curators here to discuss ways that their identities shape their lives and creative practices. The program is split into two panels, the first with Harry Gamboa Jr., Marvella Muro, Porras-Kim, and Kris Kuramitsu, moderated by Daniela Lieja Quintanar. The second panel includes Charles Gaines, Tala Mandani, Gala Porras-Kim, and Vincent Valdez, moderated by Larry Osei Mensah. Each panel will be introduced by independent curator, writer, and art historian Danielle Shang. Danielle's research and curatorial projects focus on the impacts of globalization, urban renewal, social change, and class restructuring on art making and the narrative of art history. Danielle's been a driving force in making today's program happen, as well as many, many other Hammer programs, and I'm very grateful to her for bringing her vast wealth of knowledge and experience to Hammer audiences. Before we get started, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones and note that videotaping and audio recording are not allowed in the theater, but the video of this program will be available on the Hammer website, so you can share it with friends and colleagues. And after the second panel, we'll have some light refreshment out in the theater lobby, and we can talk more out there about all the ideas that our wonderful guest speakers bring up today. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Danielle Shang.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the very first edition of Voices of the Diaspora. Before we begin the conversation, instead of performing a superficial copy and paste land acknowledgement, I would like to challenge this platitude. With the help of Native American artist Teresa Baker, I have come to an understanding that we have done it lazily. I wasn't able to craft a reasonably good acknowledgement at this time, but here's what I learned from a tribal biologist from Quiche Nation. The land acknowledgement actually damages the cultural heritage of the original inhabitants because it often lists too many tribes together in one place, and it never addresses the specific history. When Native Americans gave land acknowledgement, they acknowledged the land and the resources that came from the land, not the people, because to them, the land was here before us and it will continue to exist after us. In case you're wondering, the Quiche Nation is one of the indigenous peoples of the Los Angeles Basin. The land here holds their sacred sites and cultural remnants. The Quiche people were enslaved to build the St. Gabriel Mission as well as the Los Angeles Plaza Church. In paying tribute to indigenous peoples in Los Angeles, I would like to highlight United American Indian involvement that provides healthcare services, workforce development, and other assistance to Native Americans in Los Angeles. Teresa Baker, when she relocated herself from North Dakota to LA, this organization helped her enormously. It also acted as a community gathering place for Native Americans. Please support this wonderful organization. Now to today's topic. As diasporic artists and culture workers, we have been categorized Black, Brown, Asian American, Latinx, such and such. Is it possible to erode that vocabulary and consider us as a collective in solidarity with the indigenous people? In this mini symposium, We wanted to put diasporic experiences front and center in the debate about our shared future, about imagining changes that could brighten that shared future. The two panels, participated by luminaries in the art community, form a diptych of discussions on what kind of effort our shared future requires us, what we can learn from the past, and how to open up a space for a community that embraces different narratives equally. Our collective representations and imaginations through the lens of the diaspora have developed into a new set of cultural, social, and political realities in the US. As Audre Lorde once told us, without community, there's no liberation. But community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist. The conversation of the first panel will focus on the relationship between individual artists and their communities, and ask how diasporic artists create networks, initiatives, and interventions to lift up the marginalized status of their communities. Our moderator for the first panel is Daniela Lieja Quintanar. She's a curator and a writer originally from Mexico City. Her curatorial practice takes inspiration from everyday life, spaces of a political struggle, and communal forms of knowledge production. She's the chief curator and the deputy director of programs at REDCAT, Roy and Edna Disney CalArts Theater. She has been part of the Los Angeles Tenants Union since its foundation, collaborating with the East Side local, Union de Vecinos. Please help me welcome Daniela Lieja Quintanar and the panelists Harry Gamboa Jr., Marvella Muro, Porras-Kim, and Kris Kuramitsu. The panelists will introduce themselves on the stage.
Hello. Thank you for being here. I'm really honored to be with these amazing people, friends, colleagues. Um, in this, I'm really appreciative of this space that we're having now for dialogue when we have a very difficult time in the world. So I always appreciate when we have a spaces like this to have a conversation with you and between us. And I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists. And first, Harry Gamboa Jr., that probably most of you know him, artist, author, and educator. And the first time that I hear about Harry was, of course, through the artist group ASCO. In Mexico City, I get to see a really awesome retrospective, and later on, I get to know more about your work at LACE, Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, because he is one of the founders of LACE in the 70s. And he also have another groups like Virtual Verite, the International Performance Troupe. He also is an educator right now, teaching at CalArts. And I just want to say you are really important figure in our community, and you have been working with different generations. So I really appreciate that. And well, now I'm gonna jump with Kris Kuramitsu is an independent curator and educator that has done an extensive also contribution in Los Angeles with exhibitions in different parts of the city. And I get to meet you through your shows in the Mistake Room, but more recently, we have a group of curators that we start during the pandemic. We wanted to just talk to each other as curators and Irene Satsos organized us, and we were meeting for I think every week or every 2 weeks. And right now that we are back to work, it's been impossible to meet. So and I'm like sharing also my relationship with each of you, because I think it's important that we're going to talk about diasporas. We need to talk about the building of the community and our own relationships. Um, and I would just mention that Kris also in 2019 worked with under the Sun Foundation to launch the biennial Candlewood Arts Festival, a community center public art program in the Anza Borrego Desert. And then we have Marvella Muro, who is Director of Artistic, Curatorial, and Education Programs at Self-Help and Graphics and Art, and also somebody from LA, from East LA, that has been very involved with different communities and working also with youth, but also bringing artists into create workshops and exchange of knowledge with younger generations too, and also doing shows. And so yeah, now right now you are part of this big change in self-help and graphic, also a space for the Chicano community and also the LA community. And she's curating 6 places we call home for the Getty Foundation for the PSD Arts and Science. And finally, we have Claire, which she and I just met. And also I appreciate that about like this type of panels, and I'm sure we're gonna start a relationship. Um, uh, Claire is a curator and writer based in New York City, but also from San Diego. She is currently the manager of programs and collections at Asian Art Archive in America. She also serves as the director of curatorial strategy at the Here and There Collective. Thank you so much to be for being here with me. And now we're gonna pass through a 3 minute presentation. It's gonna be like an introduction of your practice, and then we are gonna have a conversation, and then we will open it to the audience so we can have also a conversation with you all. And Harry, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I've been working with performers for 50 years. Started off with ASCO and then moved on. My work with community actually predates ASCO. I was involved as a teenager as a student organizer for the East LA walkouts and sort of very actively involved in the Chicano movement. But that informed the violence that was the response to the Chicano movement was absolutely unbelievably violent by the police and sort of societal. And as a result of that, I wound up being placed on a Senate subcommittee list under COINTELPRO, which then threatened my life and actually ruined the lives of many people. This kind of surveillance and police behavior back then, and plus besides that, it was a Vietnam War. Many of my friends were actually dying during this period. The response was, how do you respond to such hatred, violence, and to me the answer, I guess from my perspective, was to be creative and to inform people and to maybe educate people that it's possible to make use of your body and your space and your culture and your environment and turn it into something else. And of course, as time went on and working with the groups that I have been working with, I'm currently working on a very large troupe to create portraits, is that it's important to have fun in dystopia. And how do you do that is by not succumbing to the negativity, but sort of draining the energy from that and using it as a way of creating new images, new phraseology, new perspectives, and also to be assertive for all of us that we all belong on the planet. There's no one that does not belong on the planet, and that we are all equal, and that none of us deserve to be mistreated. So.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to jump in. Kris.
Hi, everybody. Um, so I guess I'm an independent curator. I've been doing curatorial work with organizing exhibitions, private collections, et cetera, for many years. So what I wanted to talk about today were a couple of my more recent projects that I think really speak to a lot of the ideas about diaspora and community that we're going to talk about together. And so, one project that I did quite recently is a group exhibition called Voice a Wild Dream, Moments in Asian American Art and Activism, with the impossibly long time frame of 1968 to 2022. Um, and that particular exhibition focused on various art-centered and artist collectives um, that formed over the years to either address a specific problem, a specific issue, but they were all kind of artists working in the arts to kind of uh, uh, try to find ways um, to address things that were happening around them. And I think one thing that I found in focusing on these various collectives, they came together for all kinds of different reasons, for different durations, um, but they all came together by kind of making work together. So the act of creation was really the um, the way that they were kind of addressing the world around them essentially. Um, so I also wanted to talk a bit about a project that I've been working on for the last 5 years in the tiny community of Borrego Springs in the Anza Borrego Desert, um, called the Candlewood Arts Festival, which is very much rooted in this small rural community and uh, uh, we've brought together a number of artists to create public projects kind of with with and for uh, in collaboration with the local community, which is uh, a really kind of amazingly, obviously, very beautiful place, um, but also a really wonderful a wonderful sort of laboratory for, I think, for a lot of artists that are quite interested in issues of um, water and conservation, environmental change, kind of the rapid change in rural communities, and so we have been, doing this for a number of years, trying to create work with artists that uh, is as much community facing as it is, kind of visitor facing.
Okay.
Um, and that has been a really sort of deliberate part of the practice. And I also, should bring up the fact that I've been a part of this really wonderful group that arose during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, called the Asian American Pacific Islander Arts Network, which is one of our sponsors today. Um, and through that, we're a group of kind of cultural workers in Los Angeles that has been kind of creating a platform for us to have conversation, but also share and connect with other communities around LA. So
Thank you.
Me toca.
Te toca. But
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Marvella Muro. I born and raised in East Los Angeles. I went to school in Fullerton and lived in Echo Park for 10 years, and I moved back to East Los Angeles. And Chris and I spent a lot of time today talking about our career journeys. And I work at Self Help Graphics, and when I grew up in East LA, surrounded by the murals, it's very much inspired by the murals, but I was not involved in the Chicano movement. I actually kind of stepped outside of it going to school. When I went to school, I didn't want to be like stereotyped or typecast or put into this box. And it wasn't because I saw it as something negative, but I wanted to learn more. And I'm full circle back at Self Help. And one of the things that I remember when Self Help lost its building in East Los Angeles, and now they moved to Boyle Heights, one of the things that came to my head is like, I would really love to see a space where we can invite Latina artists and other artists to come and make work that doesn't have the Virgen de Guadalupe on there, that doesn't have, your typical, or they can reference them, but in a more just challenging way. And I didn't know about ASCO. And because I know I'd probably be following the whole group. And so now that I found myself at Self Help, I am learning so much of its history. I personally am working towards reshaping the narrative of what Self Help Graphics was grew out of, and it was founded by an Italian white nun, two queer Mexican immigrants. Our first master printer was a white communist, and that's one of the stories that we don't know. And the diverse or the broad cultural groups that came of people that came to the space, those stories are not elevated as they should. And so when I knew about Self Help Graphics back from outside of college, I saw it as the Chicano power kind of space. And when I speak to people, a lot of people identify it as such, but it's so much more. And like, for example, it was a space for music, performance, expression. And it's not just one expression, it's multiple expressions, multi-generational expressions and experiences. And before I joined Self Help, I was at LACMA, and I was their community engagement manager, and that opened the door to me of like my path. What I really love to do is be that bridge between the artist, the arts, and community. And how do we engage people to really connect with the arts, but more so with each other? And Self Help Graphics does that, and in a very organic and but also very intentional way. It's not these it's embedded in its mission, and that's it's embedded in me, in my values. And so what I am doing now at Self Help is more so uplifting the multicultural neighborhood or communities that surround LA. And so, like, for example, one of the pictures we have here was previous one was of Phang Nguyen, a Cambodian Vietnamese refugee, and talking about the donut kids who grew up in their parents' donut shops. But then you think about the experiences of other immigrant communities with the mom and pop shops and the kids growing up in those restaurants and those panaderias, the baker shops. And you have all these similar conversations, but also, as Danielle mentioned in her opening, those differences are also those things that connect us and then make us stronger. And in our PST, I'll wrap it up with that, is our PST is Sinks Places We Call Home. And we are working, Maru Garcia, who's on, sorry, my right. Sorry, my right. She's working addressing the contamination of lead by the Exide petroleum, the Exide battery plant. And Beatriz on the left is addressing the contamination by petroleum at the Willowbrook community, what was a predominantly African American community. And the importance of showing these two environmental injustice or justice issues is to connect LA a little more, connect the communities, the Black and Brown communities more, because we just can't continue relying or rooting down on our differences and what is lacking rather than really strengthening on those shared our our needs, our shared needs.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Kim. Thank you so much for having us here. I'm a curator and writer. I'm currently based in New York City. I've been there for a little over 10 years. And like Daniela had very kindly introduced, I was born and raised in San Diego. And so this feels like a really kind of bizarre kind of homecoming. I haven't done a lot of work on the West Coast, so it feels really special to be here and chatting about my work and being given an opportunity to have something that I can share with my family. My family's here. Um, so that feels very special because I feel like I'm constantly like the black sheep that's like moved really far away. So yeah, as you had mentioned, I am working with the Here and There Collective, one of the organizations that brought us all together here with Stephen and Lisa. And I recently started a position at Asia Art Archive in America, based in Brooklyn Heights. My background is in museum education, so I worked in education departments at a few museums in New York City for a few years. And then I was beginning to feel a bit frustrated around the distance that I saw between education departments and curatorial departments in a lot of these spaces, sometimes just in conversation, oftentimes also in distance, like physical distance between these departments. And it was during a time, and this continues, where a lot of these museum institutions are really kind of speaking about their efforts around diversity and equity. And to me, it felt like it didn't make a lot of sense that those conversations weren't happening if that was the truth. And so it was right around the time that I was also becoming good friends with practicing artists, super interested in doing studio visits, really finding like a magic in entering studios and talking to artists and feeling a lot of privilege in that kind of access to space. And so that was when I turned towards a curatorial practice. And since then, I have been really lucky to mostly be working within residencies and cohorts. And I think the way that you even introduced us today, it makes a lot of sense because I think for me, ideas of diaspora go hand in hand with ideas of community. And that I think was really embedded in me in my first kind of jobs within the field. I started off doing an internship through Studio in a School where we had a cohort. More recently, I did a residency fellowship at Next Haven. These are all spaces where folks are brought together and we kind of live and work together. So, yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know what to do with the this thing. Well, we'll leave it there because I'm trying to do too many things with my hands. But just thank you for this. It was important to kind of like bring the introduction of the practice, and we are gonna talk about diaspora. You're gonna hear me saying diaspora, so apologize for my accent. But the diaspora, um, it's about also, from the simple definition is about dispersion, and also is connected, of course, with migration and violent displacement, and connecting with what Danielle Shang, which I actually felt to thank Danielle for the invitation and the hammer, so thank you. And connecting with the land acknowledgement that she was saying, I want to invite you and invite us to consider other forms of diaspora that are not only connected with the idea of nation, that we're coming from a different nation, or like really separating us from nationalistic approaches. And I also want to mention that Los Angeles is being a place that has received many people displaced from the South Global, and also from the indigenous communities, and but also from the Native Americans that has been displaced from their lands in the 50s. Um, we have the Indian Relocation Act that like displaced tons of people here. So we not only have like Tongva, but there's another groups here, and I just want to like point it out that. And I will start with the also the idea of diaspora, that in terms of seeds, how we like spread seeds and how we grow things. And what does mean, and maybe we can start with Harry, what does mean for you diaspora, and how really this concept, beyond the concept, has been inside your practice?
Um, well, I think you and I spoke a little bit about this on the phone, but
Yeah.
uh, I think something about just sharing knowledge and life experiences, and bringing many people together to share their stories, because through mainstream media, of course, we're very limited, and even through alternate media, it becomes kind of difficult to assess. And then, of course, the social media, who knows where it even comes from. But it's kind of like, how do you live an actualized life in a virtualized world? And so that requires to actually do things out in the streets, out in the space, and this idea of spreading seeds is kind of quite literal. You have to actually go out, and if you're in an urban space, you have to actually declare that space yours, irregardless of who it actually states that owns it. And so, and the only way to do that is by being present, even if it's for a fraction of a moment you occupy, but you are able to create an image, an impression, an attitude, and you alter the space by inserting your history. And so, and that I think crosses into even my approach to teaching. I take my students out into the streets, or I kind of, for some classes that's not the process, it's directing them to different places, and to make sure that they encounter people that even they feel may be unlike themselves, and to just initiate a conversation. You might be rejected, and you might actually be accepted, but that's part of the experience, as opposed to shutting down and being fearful of engaging others.
Yeah. Yeah. Chris, do you want to jump in?
I mean, I love that as
Yeah.
like thinking about diaspora as a kind of an opportunity for connection. Like that's really thinking of it as a sort of generative condition. And so that's, I think how a lot of us approach our work as and the sort of main kernel of what we're doing. Um,
I think if I'd just like to add about within my role, really digging deep to try to listen to the voices that are not allowed or been given the space to speak. I think through self help, that's a platform for that. But also going out into the community and speaking to the youth, or in multi generational audiences that are not necessarily connected to these art spaces, because I'm not going to say that they're not connected to the arts, because in one way or another we're all connected to a creative expression in one form or another. But I think artists already are doing that in their work, and for my role it's more so like doing that extra legwork to making sure we try to reach as many people as possible, so that we do encourage that dialogue.
Claire, do you have something to share about?
Sure, I'll add on, echoing everyone. I think folks from the diaspora are often people who have experienced kind of feeling like an odd one out, or kind of different aspects of isolation or feeling difference within their identity. And from that space, I feel like once you kind of build cohort or community, there's a lot of kind of magic that happens. And of course, I think there's oftentimes a lot of focus on various kinds of intergenerational trauma or conversations around difficulties around that kind of identity. But I also think it's a space that I find the most kind of humor and notions of redemption, and a lot of playful ways to go about an identity that is often kind of misunderstood or misrepresented, and kind of finding your own pathway allows for a lot of fun in these conversations.
Yeah, and I was thinking, when we were organizing the panel, we were like, oh, there's like four curators and the artist. But Harry, you were talking about your practice as an organizing practice, your artistic practice, and I think also that's like a common point in your curatorial practice too, like the organizing community, organizing artists, and maybe if you can talk about an example of what does that mean and what challenges comes with that.
Yeah, a few years ago, I heard that the 6th Street Bridge was going to be demolished, and I bumped into the artist that had received $1 million grant to do some project as a result of the new bridge that was going to be built. And I decided I would do one that wouldn't cost me a penny, and it would be something that would involve maybe 50, 100 people to use the bridge as it was during its deconstruction, as it were. I had used that bridge throughout my life, and I wanted people to use the bridge as though to walk, talk, to have it just in the vicinity, all for photographic purposes, of course. I did share one of my images where there's a young woman in a quinceañera dress who's actually 25 at that moment. She missed her own party. She's returned and she's wondering where everyone's at, because now she's very knowledgeable and can share. But it was also making sort of a response to Los Angeles that this is a city of amnesia. Everything is destroyed. Nothing is saved. There's no reference to history. Everything is smudged, so that we really don't know where it all began in the first place. And everything, basically everything in Los Angeles is artificial turf, invasive species of every kind of plant and animal life. And then we have such a vast population of people. There's no way to really know the origin of the story. But in the end, we all begin the same way. And how do you get through life on this bridge? In the end, I worked for 3 years with people to make this photo project, organized people to show up. And in the end, I invited the LA Times to show up on the day there was no longer any bridge. But what had happened was I had developed a sort of a community of 100 artists that were now working with each other and had the experience of expressing themselves in the street, and went off and started sharing that modality of creation.
And maybe, I don't know, Marvella, if you want to share a little bit about that, the aspect of organizing, because you were talking about the organizing the artists with the community and with the arts.
Maybe if you find with PST, it's very much that, but I'd rather talk about the Day of the Dead and 2020. And so, for those who are not familiar with Self Help Graphics, Self Help has been celebrating Day of the Dead since 1972, and it begins with a procession and then a big celebration, music, a spoken word, and so it's a celebration, a traditional celebration that's been brought and adapted to and reformed and reinterpreted to the community in Los Angeles, and it continues to evolve. And for 2020, we couldn't have our exhibition and we couldn't have the celebration, but everybody, the world was mourning. So what we did is we did have our exhibition, but nobody came. We obviously the place was closed, but we needed to gather, and so we got the artist. We all met at the parking lot, and we did a call and said, let's come to the Civic Center, the East LA Civic Center. Everybody decorated their cars with the Day of the Dead theme. They had altars in the beds of their trucks. I think we had like 75 or 80 cars showing up with lowriders. It wasn't that organized. It was just go. And they all showed up. And we did ask permission from the county that with the Supervisor Solis that we're going to gather at the park. But from there, we took off, and I was like the rogue person blocking the cars so that the parade can continue or the caravan can continue. And we went down Medneck down to Whittier Boulevard all the way down, and then we drove up to what is now Cesar Chavez, back then Brooklyn, and we drove by Evergreen Cemetery, and people were leaving flowers for their loved ones at the cemetery. And I saw so many people running towards the fence to wave at us. And I think if that caravan would have taken place, I don't know, like, I don't know, where, Torrance, I don't know. There it would be like, What is that?" But here, everyone knew. Everyone knew what this caravan was about. And it was a necessary collective grief process. And it was beautiful. And I know, and that caravan was really inspired by the artist Leo Limon, who did a caravan back in the early 80s from the Fowler Museum, where Self Help Graphics had a show, and they drove Sunset Boulevard all the way to the old building, which turns into what is now Cesar Chavez. So it really is about community building. And because self help has been able to build that community, people showed up. Like people showed up to your event that you mentioned, that you hosted, that ASCO hosted at Self Help.
Yeah, there's kind of like a sense of self-organization, like a organic way, because I mean, I always think about the they call it the caravans of migrants, and I'm like, I see them as a social organization, as a social movement, that they are like really moving their bodies and like really organizing themselves to improve and transform their lives. And I think that's also embedded in all your practices. Like the bridge is you're organizing artists because and your students, but also doing a type of activism, but it's like a heritage also, no, from your own community. And I think that naturality is very interesting. And maybe Kris, if you want to share about your show and Oxy, because I think it has a lot of connections with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think this kind of there were a number of collectives that I included in the exhibition that would not necessarily, I think, would not necessarily call themselves activist collectives. They're I think that in the process of, kind of creating music or creating, other kinds of art forms, creating a zine, this kind of creativity and the way that they kind of gather people around this kind of creative practice is really a kind of activism that hasn't really necessarily been talked about as such or acknowledged as a sort of social and political power that it really is. So, I mean, just to be very, just as a kind of example of this, um, we included in the show a section on the Linda Lindas, which is a kind of teen punk band in LA. They're all they're four kind of preteen teen musicians that kind of gained viral notoriety during the pandemic with the like a performance of a song, "Racist Sexist Boy," that they sang at the LA Public Library. So this group, they, come from a heritage of, kind of punk rock attitude and punk rock, kind of, actually, punk as a kind of social organizing, really. Um, they actually formed initially because and their first performances were at fundraisers for their elementary school, for their elementary school music program. So it sort of, they sort of began as a sort of, uh, their performances anyways supported, this kind of community-based art, art making. Um, so, and I think they, as they perform, they really, um, sort of embody this kind of empowerment of young women, young Asian women, giving, kind of a loud platform for a perspective that I think especially was needed and had been, kind of silenced during the pandemic. Um, so yeah, that as one example.
Yeah, and I think Claire, the maybe you can share some of the inspirations of why you and your friends create the Here and There collective, because I think it's also embedded with this of need of these spaces as a platform.
So, Stephen and Lisa founded the Here and There in 21, and I was brought on a few months after they had started their work together. And I think that we often kind of center, of course, we do our exhibitions and our performances, and we invite folks for like these big, snazzy events and things. But I think the real important work that happens within the Here and There is that we bring folks together and then we allow for like we have like dinner parties and events as such where folks really make friends. And from there, I think my favorite thing that I hear about are the group chats that are created where artists are able to ask really, important questions around, hey, this collector reached out to me. Has anyone worked with them before? This gallerist is, not treating me very well. Like, how do I deal with this? Does this loan form look okay? Like, these questions that are often really kind of not talked about publicly, that are often the most important kind of cruxes and steps within an artist's kind of movement into their career. I think that's where I think a lot of the help and a lot of that kind of organizing makes the most impact.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I feel like in the art world, we tend to no, I try not to like in to be individuals. No, it's like the art is individual, and then you go through your own path and you fight from to get there wherever you want to go. It's like this idea of like profession, and you just have to keep going. And for curators, it's like you have to jump from institution to institution to be, the curator. And I think these alternative forms, and also in the art practice, of are very important, because it's always like consulting or having the backup of that community,
It's filling a gap. It's filling a gap that is very much needed, especially in historically white institutions, and that's a gap that's needed in community. Of that's why like these groups of curators formed during the pandemic, or these different organizations that have formed, like smaller institutions like Lava, and that have formed because there is a gap of support because of the structures that within the nonprofit complex, the limited resources, or the resources going towards larger institutions. So these collectives, coalitions, groups are formed to fill the gap.
Yeah, and then now that you bring up the idea of coalition, I think in the United States we are also, again, the tag of what are you? Are you Asian? Are you Latinx or Latine or Chicano? Like I always say, like when I came here, they're like, "What are you?" And I was just like, "Mexican." But now I don't want to be Mexican. I want to be from everywhere. But I mean, just like the tags of like, are you brown, or like the colors, like all this. I feel like in the arts, and especially in contemporary art, we end being in one side, or just talking with one group. I am the Hispanic curator. I have received that weird label. Um, but I think like all of you had actually built inside your practice coalition. And I think that's also, it's not that it's just happening now. Coalition is like come from many places, but I think Los Angeles and California has that history of social movements. I remember meeting for the first time Emory Douglas, and we are doing a show with Essence Harden. And I was telling him, "Oh, I'm doing a show about the Teatro Campesino." And he's like, "Oh, you should go and look to these newspapers from the Black Panthers. We were in coalition with them, like in the 70s." Like, maybe if you want to share a little bit about, like, Kris, you have worked not only with Asian artists, of course, and Harry, you always bring a very diverse community with you, and you also were part of the Chicano movement that was in coalition with other movements. And if everybody want to share a little bit about building coalition and maintaining coalition.
Well, uh, yeah, I guess I think I mentioned this story before, but on my first day of kindergarten, I was slapped in the face by the teacher who needed to impart to me the importance of speaking English. And the lesson I learned was that I didn't need school. And so I never went to school and learned English quite well nonetheless. But along the way, one of the important things that I realized was that I was not about to face this alone. I was going to need the help of an entire community. And then as I grew, I realized that no, we're all interdependent globally. We're all interdependent within our city, in our community. Not always does it work out. Sometimes some coalitions are quite temporary. Some, everyone's moving in their own trajectory and doing different things. But along the way, you make steps and you build communities along the way, or you build relationships. And people then reconnect and make other coalitions, and this makes sort of an entire cohesive environment in which not only are people activists, but they become sort of sort of iconic performers, as it were, of our times. And so that's, for me, one of the more important things, I guess, with photography is I photograph people that seem to be iconic and then work to make that iconic image of them, which then proves the point. And then it's introduced into academia, into mainstream media, pop culture, give it a name or a title some way, a concept. Some of my earlier works, I would create a photograph and then write 100 versions of what it actually was, and none of them actually matched, and send them out everywhere to get people to argue about what they thought the photograph was about. And in the end, I would have maybe torn up the original photograph, and there was no evidence of anything ever taking place. So, and then that would just generate a myth. And so, and of course, we all live in very mythical times, but it's all of it is constantly being deleted and reprinted. And so, which version are we at this moment?
Yeah, I always love the. I think recall you talking about your work existing as rumor, and like that's where the work is. It's the rumor, and when you're kind of when you're talking about it with other people, that's it's the trying to reactivate the memory, and it comes alive in conversation between people, and that's what it is. I always love that about.
I mean,
Yeah.
and our species is all based on communication, and
Yeah.
everyone's so intelligent that most people don't realize how smart they all really are. And so I think that's part of the work, is to engage and ignite the recognition of our intelligence as being human beings.
Yeah, that I was also thinking about the importance of being connected, and I was just telling you about our group that now we are again back to the capitalist system and working insanely in art. And I just think it's important also to address that as cultural workers we are working in a very precarious forms, and we really need to transform that. Like we are always, I feel like all my colleagues, we are always talking about like how to work less, how to do less, because we need to take care of our bodies. We need to engage and be connected. And that labor is also like very challenging. Also, like the labor of like just, creating a platform like yours, and then at the same time being in contact with the others and listening what the others are doing. That's like a big challenge. And that's why I'm saying like, oh, thank you, you bring us here. I didn't have to do that labor, but then we need to do that labor. I think graphics does that, and you as your
Yes, exactly. But I think we're even if we're speaking about it within our own in small groups, we still then have to go back to the institution or and even if as an independent curator, if you're being hired by an institution to do that work, you have to abide by some of those structures. And at South, we've been doing actually like 2 years worth of work of internal conversations of revisiting our values. What are our values? What is our mission? And how does that reflect internally in our work process, but also how does that reflect externally the of what the community expectations, because it's such a community organization, so rooted in community, there's so much investment and people really feel ownership. So we are called out frequently if we do something that community disapproves of. But as the staff member moving the organization forward, how what are the expectations that we have to establish with our community members and other partners, institutional partners, that are realistic and sustainable, and really just sticking to that, and I think also individually within your own employers, what are your boundaries? And yeah, I think that it comes down to boundaries and really everyone being on board on your shared mission. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think about it all the time because I feel like, care and caretaking and rest as resistance, like these are all big buzzwords right now for contemporary art. And a lot of artists are kind of creating works within that sphere. A lot of writing is being done around these actions. And yet I talk to some of my really good friends who are artists who kind of forefront that language, and they're the most overworked and burnt out folks who are working right now. And I don't know what it may be. I think possibly a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of folks who work within the arts and cultural sphere start off kind of doing the work that they do as a hobby and because they love it. And then from there, I think there's also this like scarcity mindset where you kind of have to say yes to everything. And if you say no to one thing, you're going to lose a lot of other opportunities. And, I think this is really embedded in the kind of like the DNA of what a lot like what pushes a lot of the things kind of within the
That's the
arts forward.
capitalist
And
structure.
that's the capitalist structure. And I think that a lot of it has to do in terms of how we kind of step back from that is kind of leaning on these communities that we are building and trusting that things will still be around and that opportunities will still come. And part of that is really kind of putting a lot of trust in the people that you're surrounding yourself with, and being ready for when you're ready, and rather than kind of working within like a burnt out state.
Yeah, I mean, as an independent curator, that is like a constant state of burnt out. But I will say that, an organization like Under the Sun Foundation, I think is a really, I don't know, I'm always trying to help to sort of rethink ways to do the things that we do and like uplift the artists and the work that we love. Um, and I think with Under the Sun Foundation, they've provided this really amazing opportunity to think about this, this kind of this public art project in this very tiny little town, to scale it in a way that makes sense for the artists and for the town itself, and just actually allowing me to think about ways that we can work with a smaller number of artists in a deeper way over a longer period of time. And just even something very simple, structural like that, actually is allows a lot of avenues for different kinds of work to open up that are not available in other ways, and also allows the group of artists that I'm working with, to actually really connect in different ways with the really complicated communities out there, and complex in a way that only small town communities can be very complex. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think just thinking about, I'm super grateful for that different kind of structure, but being able to think about a different way of working, um, is I don't know, something that I'm seeking always, and trying to cultivate in any way that I can. And I think that is one of the things that came out of one of the most horrible times for all of us at this the moment of the pandemic, allowing us to kind of stop and actually hope, with some kind of to stop and think of different ways through. Um, Now we need to follow up on that, of course, as we said, but um, yeah,
Yeah,
always looking for that.
um, thank you for that. And then I think that also is connected with another question that we were talking about, like how do we preserve our own work, our own histories and memories, and maybe you can tell us more about like archiving. Like I think Harry, your practice is taking photos, but you also are creating an archive that also gives different, ideas. So like, yeah, like what the an archive is such a also Western um, concept that we are also it's a trend. But like, how can we preserve our memories for the next generations?
Well, um, I think in the 80s, I must have spent 3 years burning everything I owned. And a few things were preserved and are now at the Stanford archives. But the whole concept has been that sometimes it doesn't actually have to be material. It's how do you insert an idea so that it catches on, generate a term, maybe generate an image. I would have to say that probably most of my images exist being reproduced in books or in magazines or have appeared online, and very few have ever been printed. So no one's ever seen the photograph, and so and the same with the terminology. I haven't written many books, but many interviews in which different terms I might include don't exist in the Oxford Dictionary, but then become very common terms. And then they become either titles of museum shows or something else or someone's dissertation. And again, it's introducing so many different people that are historically significant until you pay close attention that maybe they really are part of history, but they would have been ignored. And so it's always like introducing people to be in front of the camera or on view. As I mentioned before, my approach to portraiture is you perform your portrait, but you also live this performance. And then in some way it is you, but you're really expressing, it's a sort of an existentialist statement of in postmodern times, pre-nuclear catastrophe times, why is it so important to express the now and the living, because it is very easy to simply be forgotten while you're here.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Okay, so I guess we are gonna wrap up for questions. Yeah, I just want to say that the last one because I feel like we wanted the last one of the last questions, and maybe somebody wants to respond. Like, how do we deal with the idea of living on the margin and the term marginalized artists or marginalized curators? I'm just like very curious about you, how you understand that, and how can we push to integrate in the context of contemporary art, be, um, without becoming the others, the trend, or the exotics? How can we gain territory inside the institutions? I think this is gaining territory and also maintain alternative models. I don't know if somebody wants to respond to this, the marginalized. Um,
I'll answer this with regards to self-help
mhm,
very briefly, is that to pushing forward the fact that self-help graphics, the work, its impact is beyond Boyle Heights, East LA East Side. It is part of the U.S. narrative, the art history canon, the history canon of the United States. And when we are marginalized in tiny, as just Latino, Latina, Latine, Chicano, it's such a disservice to the work, the process, and everything that grew and how it's impacted internationally. Because, for example, with self-help, the work has traveled internationally to Africa, to all over Latin America. A lot of people don't know this, but a lot of people, a lot of printmakers, especially printmakers, know about self-help graphics. And they've worked with each other, with other cultures, worked together in the studio, or the artist that learned about the printmaking process have gone on to learn in other spaces outside of California. So it's by continue to be that support, that platform, and really providing guidance to the new generations of artists. That's how we continue leaving that mark and making sure that we are in control of the narrative.
Thank you. Well, now we want to open to questions. I think there's going to be a microphone or various microphones.
Thank you. Um, my name is Beatriz. I wanted to make a comment and also ask a question. I think thank you for this beautiful panel. I think it's really important to have one more panel about diaspora. I wanted to say that definitely this is not the first panel about diaspora that we have had. Our communities have been speaking about this for decades. And I think one of the things that we have been talking about is the importance of understanding the term diaspora across temporality, so that we don't imagine diaspora being limited to the way in which we imagine the contemporary world, where borders are created, but borders that are made by nations that have only existed for 200 years, which is nothing, and will not exist forever, which is also nothing. And I wanted to say that in other times, before these modern borders, indigenous peoples in the Americas, which is known as Abya Yala today, also migrated. And they crossed the contemporary borders, which didn't exist, and came from here, moved there, went back, went from Central Mexico to Central America, etc. And so our idea that certain indigenous groups live in Mexico, or are from El Salvador, or are from Guatemala, or are from California, is an idea that's linked to the nation, and it's really important to step outside that temporality and to imagine people's movements and across other times. And so I wanted to say that as part of the Central American community, for me, it's really important to fight for its visibility, but also to fight for the knowledge that ancient peoples inherited, left to us, to remember their movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatriz. Do we have another question?
Hi, I'm Rodrigo. I have a question about trust. It's you mentioned trust at one point. Thanks. So I'm thinking about trust. I'm wondering if you can expand a bit on how you develop trust with your communities and how you can develop trust with other communities or people who are emerging. So how is the kind of like trust process? How does that work for you, especially when it's like, somebody new is coming in or different communities are now connected and you're maybe in the in between having to be like, yeah, we have to trust each other. So how have you done that? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's super tough because I think that oftentimes folks come into the field super bright eyed, bushy tailed, really open to anyone and everyone. And there are big personalities in our field, and there are big egos, and there are all different kinds of people that you are working with, whether that be artists or arts practitioners or arts workers. And I think that for me, at least, it has been about showing up to as many spaces as possible, kind of going to not just arts openings, but various dinners, being open to inviting folks who I follow on Instagram, who I've been inspired by, and being kind of wary, but also open enough. You know, I think that a good example is how I was introduced to Stephen and Lisa for the Here and There collective. I think at a point when I was especially jaded by the field, and I was really skeptical of these two strangers coming to me and asking about my work and being integrated. And I think that my trust with them was really built over meals. I find that especially helpful to kind of share food with people, and you really get to understand different personalities, what people are prioritizing in their life, not just in their, art collection, but also just in who they are, how they build their lives, and things like that. Yeah, it's tough.
And just, to build on that, it's like, it's time, right? Time is, everything. So time, and also kind of a sense of mutual, I think it's mutual stakes or mutual investment, and making sure that, across all kinds of differences, if you can communicate, and kind of demonstrate and have everybody understand your mutual, commitments and investments, I guess. That's, and that all also comes with time, right? So
I think there's no more questions. One more? Sorry, I just can't see.
Hi. I think one thing that's missing in the conversation is talking about scarcity models and people getting burned out is the funding arm, the funding element, because as you say, it is a capitalist model, and oftentimes the funding element is always end goal driven. And these kind of coalitions that we're talking about are not always going to be like that. So that's, I think, one thing we need to call attention to as a community is to really think about the ways that we can fund things that doesn't necessarily have a clear-cut end goal and support that as a networking model. The other thing I wanted to ask with Kris and Harry especially is, do you feel like community building and coalitions right now is different from the past? Like, have we progressed in some way? Or is it just a different model at this time? Because I think, especially the two of you, as you well know, like in the 80s and 90s, and this real push for multiculturalism was a very different model from, I feel like, where we are right now. We seem to have more attention to intersected identities, something that has been discussed in this forum.
So at this point in time, the one thing that's probably not going to come from me is youthful exuberance. But what does come with that is sort of decades and decades of a lot of experience of recognizing that it's important to not lose focus on what it is one would like to accomplish. And I think I mentioned previously that there's some things really do require sort of extensive funding, and yet other times things don't really require very much. It requires sort of just seizing the moment, putting something together. Of course, to get anything disseminated, to get build an exhibition or to do things, that requires a lot of funds, but not necessarily for outreach. It's really possible to do many, many things on an extremely low budget, almost a zero budget. And there are ways to reach a billion people without really trying too hard. And so the focus is, who is it that you want to impress? Of course, my way of talking is not going to impress some grant-making organization, but if that's your goal, it is possible to also achieve that. And so, you have to kind of direct your attention to what it is you want to receive in exchange.
Yeah, and I just add in terms of the foundations, I think there's also like a belief that we, especially in the United States, because of philanthropic culture, that we can't live without these foundations. And like when you're inside the institution, you're like writing all these grants like crazy maniac. And I also feel like we need to also push them because they are asking us. So we need to push them like, no, don't, I don't know. And I think some foundations are hearing, like don't make us do exhibitions every 2 years, massive exhibitions 2 years, and then defund us later, you know. I I just think like yeah, it's a game, but also it's a place also for negotiations. And I think coalitions are important when you are going to negotiate with big foundations and how they can change their rules and their structures because we are feeding them, not the opposite.
I just want to chime in about I mentioned earlier about the fact that our smaller organizations receive less funding than the larger white institutions, and then small cultural organizations run by people of color receive even less. So we are through the horrific loss and murder of George Floyd, we are experiencing a channel of funding through foundations, and it falls down to white guilt. And but are you going to continue funding? And so what's next after that? So we do need to have those conversations like with the funders to really shift the way that they are approaching funding the arts and the creative fields. And because we we also need to push back on those restrictions, the strings like those with strings attached, and just be general operating costs, not for this or this or this specifically. But we also need the people support. It's not only founders. We need the people support, the people who we are doing this work for. So that's very crucial too.
And I would say, there is, to speak to the question about coalition building and maybe differences from the past, there's obviously, and there is an incredible history of cross-cultural organizing, as Daniela said, especially in California. But I think, one thing to point at that is somewhat different is we're here now, right? So this kind of conversation that's happening, and self-organized, and but happening in the under the kind of umbrella of this institution, and having the Hammer hosting this conversation. And I don't know, it is somewhat different, I think. And yeah, I mean that I would just point to us on this stage now.
And outside.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and that's such a important point. Like that's when I was thinking like how can we gain terrain, but also this is not a trend. We're gonna be here, right? It's like yeah, we need to push for that too because there's also like an exploitation about like the diasporas and our communities and also like we need to like like we have frequently panels about community and then they always put me in the community one, not in the curatorial, or like I think we need to transfer. We are like all these persons here are like in different places. You also like why we cannot be in an art fair. So this is in the context of the art fair, right? So we need to also not we but also the exterior need to recognize the diasporas in the different areas of the arts, right?
Yeah, because everyone's, burned out from the last openings in the last 2 days, right? But they're not out participating in the work that's being done outside of these blue chip spaces.
Yeah, white structures. Yeah. Okay, I think we're gonna wrap up. Thank you so much for being here, and the next panel is gonna be very exciting. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can you help find Charles? I don't see Charles. Hi, everyone. We are not going to have a break, and so we're going to power through so we don't lose momentum. And I want to welcome everyone to the second session of our mini symposium, Voices of the Diaspora. In this panel, our guest speakers are going to engage in a conversation that explores how diasporic experiences inform their artistic, cultural, pedagogical, and social practices, and how artists can expand their identity expressions in their works. Our moderator today is Larry Osei-Mensah, a Ghanaian American curator and a culture critic who uses contemporary art and culture as form to redefine how we see ourselves and the world around us. He has organized exhibitions, conversations, and programs with commercial and nonprofit spaces around the globe. He co-founded ARTNOIR, a nonprofit whose mission is to drive racial equality in the art world by centering creatives, curators, collectors, and communities of color. So please help me welcome Larry and the artists Charles Gang, Tela Madani, Gala Porras-Kim, and Vincent Valdez.
Huh? Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. We need a little bit of energy. You guys trudge through whatever the weather is outside. Excited to be here, and clap it up for that first panel, please. I'm gonna buy some time while Charles has a bio break. I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Gala, Vincent, Tala. Charles will be here in a second. To give a little bit more context, well, one, shout out to the Hammer. Thank you for hosting us. Shannon, Claudia, shout out to the Here and There. Shout out to the AAPI Artist Network, ARTNOIR. This is the second kind of iteration of these conversations. Last year we had a conversation at Soho House that was, exploring this question around diaspora identity through an Asian and Black perspective, and it was really interesting. Welcome, Charles. To see how energized the audience was, and we knew that something was there. And I think a lot of things that have come up earlier in the conversations about interdependence, coalition, solidarity. These are all things that I think are important to all of us who've collaborated to put this together. And I think to kind of expand our idea of notion, and I think I was talking earlier to Shannon, and it was like, she said something, I was like, oh wow, thinking about diaspora as a framework for sowing seeds, not only cultural seeds, but seeds of ideas. And so I'm super excited for us to be in conversation. So we will start with intros. The artists will give you just a little bit of context about their practice, conversation, and then we'll have a Q&A. at the end. So this is going to be a fun conversation. I'm excited. We did a Zoom and it was energetic. So I'm hoping we transfer that Zoom energy to IRL. So welcome, Charles. We'll start with you, Charles Gaines. If you just want to share a little bit about your practice.
Yes, the work I do is generally referred to as conceptual practice or conceptual art, and it involves making work based on systems, and my use of systems is really a critical framework of the work because it's intended to raise questions about certain ideas of artistic production and practice, what ideas of what a work of art, why a work of art is a work of art, and essentially it's around the idea that a work of art is subjective practice, and so I wanted to create a work where the work was not made subjectively, essentially, the caveat is, of course, is that the strategies that I put into place, the systems that I put into place, are a product of my imagination, but the work is then given over to systems, and that those systems make the decisions that normally we attribute to our poetic unconscious. And the two parts of this systems approach, one is that it engages image production through a simple numbering, a grid work mapping system where objects and images take on a gridded form and enter a relationship, a serial relationship where their gridded properties go about the production itself. In other words, those properties that are gridded become available to a system and can be used by a system to produce itself. And the other is, I call it the language-based work, which is essentially dealing with the linguistic system, where I undertake discourses, social and public political discourses, and take them apart, unpack them by reducing them to their signifying functions, and sort of fragmenting them so that they're disassociated, and create a situation where I call upon the audience to create linkages and associations.
Thank you. Tala.
That was so well timed, Charles. The images, that was spot on. Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation to be part of the panel. Oh gosh, so I make paintings and animations. And how do I make paintings and animations? I guess from a very early on, I knew I was really interested in figurative paintings. So a lot of my choices have been, and I think this is just the way my brain works, through knowing what I don't want to do or understanding how I don't want to do something, and then finding something that isn't offensive to all of my don'ts. So yeah, I realized that I couldn't, for instance, make paintings of women without getting in the pitfalls of female presentation, physical presentation, and sort of adding to that problem. And so that so I'll paint men, and that didn't seem to cause any problems for me. So, so a lot of my choices, and even this discussion, I think my perspective my thinking will be, well, these are the set of problems of, let's say, the notion of diaspora. So how do we navigate around it? I went to Oregon State, and I think even that, we're in Los Angeles, and thinking about the topic of the day is so different in relation to the city which you live. So coming from Iran to Oregon definitely affected my interest in, my first impression of America, or my new environment. And painting has always been a way of thinking about painting as language. So I guess I was realizing today or yesterday, recently, that I think the paintings, if you were to give them a kind of a literary style, they're for me, they're like essays, or they're not really narrative, they're not fiction, they're not, to me, they're just essays. And they suggest a position, and then we can think about them. What is another thing? Manifesto is too much. They're not a manifesto. Of course, every artwork is a manifesto because it's a position. It's you're choosing something. But I think I like the idea of the essay. And I make really large works. This is a larger work. It's called Shadow Friends, and then really small work like the one you saw last time, and some animations. You can run through them. And what else can I say? Lord, that was not so well timed. And I think I used humor just because that's less. It works for me. I'll probably endlessly try to make jokes tonight on stage. Thank you for your laughs. I appreciate it. This has sound, but we thought we didn't need the sound because you can imagine the sound for this one. All of them they have local sounds. This was actually I think I made this very soon after Trump was elected. Very soon. I just thought something just dropped on our head. So thank you. Oh,
Thank you, Tyler.
thank you.
Vincent Valdez.
Thank you all for being here today. I'll be complete opposite of that. I don't know that I'll get any laughs. No, I offer this work as a report. It is my visual testimony about my own life's experiences and observations in 21st century America. I started, image making really was my very first language in life. I was drawing before I could walk or talk. And so I always felt naturally compelled by the idea of connecting and communicating with the world around me through pictures. For me, confronting the challenges about our American identities and realities are really the sole investigative, inspiring notions that keep me propelled in the studio, keep me moving. I was born in San Antonio, Texas. By the time I was 9 years old, I began training as a young muralist. I spent all of my youth and teen years working in the housing projects, sitting up on scaffolding under the hot Texas sun, painting murals. For me, this was a very a transformative experience. I recognized at that moment in time, it was like an epiphany. This is what my calling was. I consider it to be my first form of education as a young muralist because I saw the connections that images and the power that images could have on the masses, almost in the spirit of the WPA movement in America. It was going to be my life's effort to be able to present images about people that told stories about people and for people. At that moment in time, that life-changing experience also gave me my very first, probably somewhat premature insight into the realities about America and life in America, because I saw that within my own communities that were divided by train tracks in the south side of San Antonio. Although less than a mile apart, my own community might as well have been on an entirely different planet from what I was experiencing and observing in these housing projects. So I knew something was not right, and I remember sitting up on the scaffolding and making a commitment, vowing to myself at that moment in time that this was going to be my life's intention in work, was to tell the story about my own community, be it the Mexican-American Chicano community, about the community in South Texas or the American Southwest. And I was going to bring these tales with me as a means to insert and inject them into the canon of the mainstream and much broader, wider, and more complicated conversation of what it constitutes to be an American.
Thank you, Vincent. Gala.
Hi. Beep. Thank you all for coming here today and inviting me to present some ideas about my work. I'm mainly making a lot of works recently about history and how contemporary motivations sort of shape the way we understand a historical past that we might not be able to access anymore. And I think that through looking at the contemporary methodologies of representation of history, we can really see a lot of the motivations by people about how different histories are told, or what are the priorities from institutions or communities themselves to either self-represent or present other people's narratives. And formally, I am interested in how institutional methodology works, and sort of but in relationship to the limits of like practicality, because at some point a lot of the methodologies that institutions have come to like a very practical end. And so what happens, many of the works that I'm looking at is how to go beyond the practicality of, you know, conservation or registration or display, to be able to think through ideas of different types of representation of the past. I am very influenced by Charles and systems as well, and so I think that for me is sort of been thinking about how to see the tube of methodology by throwing sort of placeholders into systems that already exist. And so for me, I've placed a lot of these ideas in Latin America, specifically in Mexico, because I'm Colombian, but I grew up in Los Angeles, so I've always had a close, very, very close relationship to Mexico, because we are here. And a lot of the works are also related to Asia, because my mom is Korean. So I'm trying to figure out how through my works I can learn about these communities that are haven't been I haven't physically been there. So how to throw energy at a place that I would like to know more about.
Thank you. Thank you guys all for sharing. Um, my first question, this is for everybody, so whoever feels like compelled to respond. How do you think about the notion of diaspora? And I think I'm, for the sake of this conversation, beyond cultural, thinking about it as a framework, this the space of possibility to sow these seeds of ideas, or to fill in these gaps, tell these stories, use the practice as a forum to navigate or articulate. How do you think about the notion of diaspora in relationship to your respective practices, or the things that you're trying to get to the practice, whether it's systems, whether it's using representation? I'm just kind of curious for anybody.
Are we going in order, or we just you just looked
Not,
at
freestyle it. This is this. They're getting a sneak peek at an intimate conversation, so let's hear.
Yeah. I think that a lot of the questions about diaspora for me are not necessarily rooted in a specific geography, but you know, because I think a lot of the conversations now are like attached to a specific country or continent or something. But I think like one of the things that Beatriz mentioned is also thinking in different timelines. Like we just happen to be in a specific moment in time in which these sort of borders exist, but they're always moving, and they're, you know, not necessarily a stable position. So I like to think about it more in like fourth dimension.
I mean, if well, it's really interesting, because in this panel and the previous panel, one of the things that really changes the reality of a whatever diasporic experience is the population of that other group in that community. So if you have a large enough population, whether it's then you can create the communities that we're talking about. Then we can create, you know, it depends. So it depends where you're at and what you have access to. For me, what I've realized from moving from Iran was that in America, well, Los Angeles is different. We're in Westwood after all right now. But generally speaking, there are not that many Iranians, let's say, in America compared to, let's say, Chinese Americans, or, I mean, we have Charles Gaines here as in a diasporic thing. So this is a very different experience. And I realized that I was in a country who in Oregon who knew nothing about Iran. So I became, oh wait, I know everything about you. You know nothing about me. Let me tell you everything. So fast forward, sometimes the diasporic experience makes you more conservative, having moved away from the original home, than your generation who stayed, because you are in a new place, conserving the history that you've left. So now, oh wait, you don't know about, let's say, this tradition, my work will encompass that. You don't know about this language, my work will encompass that. You don't, so the artist's work becomes a kind of conservation project for a new population, and it holds that artist very much in the past. They might go back and, the people of the same generation have moved forward, didn't have to explain all that to an audience. So they've been able, so my experience has been not to really fight the conservative requests from an environment that wants an explanation or contextualizing, so that I could have a personal experience that has many revolutions for myself in the work, and isn't sort of interested always in giving a full backdrop to where it comes from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was thinking about the term. Once we were told that we're going to be talking about the idea and concept and experience of diaspora. Since I'm the youngest person on stage, my relationship, really I'm the oldest. I don't want that to shock anybody, but my relationship with even the term is unusual. I have no relationship with the term of diaspora, and so I was thinking, well, maybe I should think about, maybe I do, and maybe I should think more deeply about it, and I thought that the term, for the most part, is a broad construct. The specific narrative of diasporic life is different with different people. So I thought that it's a term that is heavily dependent and informed by the history of the reasons why a population became diasporic, and thinking about the reason why Black Americans. But thinking about that history, I thought it's a kind of a unique history where there's population dispersion, mostly created by the transatlantic slave trade, and that in the course of that, there was an estranged relationship between Black Americans and Africans. That happened for a long time. I mean, when I was a kid, and even when I was a young adult, the Africans pitied African Americans, but pretty much, and so there was no connection. And then the African Americans had their own problems with the effects of racism and the program of erasure of identity, and so there was the struggle of trying to get away from white values, to look white, like the hair problem and the nose problem and the lips problem, and everybody wanted to look like Rock Hudson or something like that, and so there was this political effort in the '60s to change all of that, the Black Power movement and so forth, but that, and at the same time, as that was changing, as there became this, as that was changing, there became this international critique of the history of colonial practices and the history of the slave trade, because there began these international conferences that happened that where Black Americans and Africans would get together and talk about this whole problem of the colonization project and the slave project, the consequence of that, and the relation between Africans and Black Americans got closer. And so at a certain point, it became international. So it's the closest idea that I can think of a true diasporic population, because Africans and African Americans actually got closer, and even the blacks in the Caribbean and blacks in South America and so forth. It's we're a close population. So I said that, well, how does that relate to my work? And I think it does, because I thought that out of this community and discussion came a general critical investigation in what's called the decolonial project. And so to that respect, I think the subject of the diasporic is very much related to me and my practice, because I really think that I'm involved in the decolonizing project. That is the idea of trying to dismantle, the white institutional framework, or at least finding a relationship where that framework doesn't disempower you. And so this is just a general project, and I think that I'm involved in that. And so I was happy. I jumped up and down with glee. That, yeah, it means something to me.
Thank you. You want to add? Okay. Got a quick question. I just want to build on what you shared in the presentation about um, responding to your Colombian heritage, your Korean heritage, Mexico as a space of, I guess, inspiration, for lack of a better word, for the practice. Can you talk a little bit more about how these different aspects of your experiences, whether they be personal, cultural, kind of help inform your practice, particularly when you're thinking about histories, going into an archive, collaborating with institutions, sometimes reframing, renaming, recontextualizing?
Yes, I think it's been sort of awkward talking about my own personal history, but I can see that in my work I have looked at trajectory of antiquities and how basically they exist under like a current taxonomy today, but that's not the only function and cataloging way that this object has existed in. That all of a sudden, like all of the antiquities that we see had all of these other functions and lives before its current iteration as a historical object. And so now when I think in terms of the relationship to my own understanding, like we as our bodies are also going through the similar taxonomies, we're like, categorized in all of these different groups. Like I'm a woman and I'm an artist and I make drawings or sculpture or painting or, and so there's so many different taxonomies that are placed on it. And so in terms of my own trajectory, I have moved a lot and have collected and experienced many of different groups, which, just because, and for one reason or another, when I experience a new community, that doesn't erase any of the previous ones. And so it's always a matter of like, because I'm half Colombian, half Korean, people are always like, you're 50-50. And I like to say that I'm like 100% both, because there's no like actual border to the amount of room that there is to live in. And so I'm thinking like, yes, I'm Colombian, but moving to LA, I really connected more with the Mexican community because it was the only like majority of Spanish speaking people that I grew up with, and because I couldn't go back to Colombia for a very long time. And then also like I'm also Korean and I'm also American and I'm also from Los Angeles and now I live in England, so now I'm also that. And so it's also like the adding of these sort of identities don't sort of require leaving any of the other ones. And so through my work is also thinking like objects and collections also do that. Just because we are able to see a singular current historical way, you know, I'm interested in how that single taxonomy doesn't actually delete any of the previous like ritual functions or other ways that other groups have understood this material.
To piggyback that, was there a particular moment or project to help you come to the realization that all of these experiences are additive? Because I think being here in the US, I think there's a tendency to say, well, you have to choose. You are 50-50. You can't be this, you can't be that. But you've come to the understanding that you can be all.
I think, I guess personally, it was when I was very young and I moved to the US and I had to, you know, in US you can only have one last name, and I was really worried because I'm like, how, you know, in Latin America you have both names of both your parents, and I think one of my earliest experiences when I was like, how can, does it mean that when I moved to the US, just because the structure of the naming doesn't allow for two people to exist, how can I bypass the structure that exists? So I hyphen my name, and so now it feels like it's one last name, but it's really two. And so in a way, it's just that was the moment in which it was like how to find again practical, the border of practical thing where it's like if I just add one extra letter, character, this line really allows for, you know, an addition thing, and also to exist within an American system that only does that. But I mean, that's only like personal ways, but I think that that sort of led me to imagine ways in which the subject of my work also can bypass their own, uh, you know, borders or um, not borders, yeah, borders in the specific containers that they currently exist in, or the top container actually, because there's many, many. Yeah.
And then Vincent, you know, some of the themes in your practice, they explore identity, race, social justice. How did you land on these themes as things that you wanted to use the practice as a platform to interrogate? And secondarily, why uh, this painting been the primary modality? You talked a little bit about the murals kind of being the entry point, but if you can share a little bit more.
You know, I think that the idea of trying to counter these notions of power or hegemony, identity, they really were sparked. You know, I come from a family of storytellers, and my father, my grandfathers, and grandmothers. So I was very alert, like hyper aware of the world around me. I was very interested in these tales that were being passed down to me. And I remember, you know, being 4 or 5 years old, and I was so impacted by listening to the story of my dad while viewing these images in this little scrapbook that he had. And I would ask him over and over again to tell me about how and why he got drafted during the Vietnam War, 1969. And he tells me the story about how he, you know, left work, his shift in high school at the grocery store, walked home, opened the mailbox, and he had this induction notice to report in 4 days. And then he would tell me the story about walking into the Henry B. Gonzalez Convention Center, the arena in downtown San Antonio, and he said he'd never forget how he walked in, opened the doors, and saw an ocean of the back of boys' heads, thousands of them. It immediately struck him how the majority of these heads were black and brown. He had already lost friends in that war, and he panicked because he said, I know I'm not going to make it back. And so he went up to the Air Force recruiter and said, please let me take your test. I'm very good at math. And the recruiter laughed at him and said, Mexicans don't know how to do math. And it was all so strange and compelling to me, and so I would look at these visuals of, you know, his experience during you know, his tour of duty, and then at that time, you know, mixed in with the activity of being a young muralist, you know, as I said earlier, it really was all I needed in terms of just igniting me in a way that I had never really felt before. You know, the ideas of not only conveying and passing down my own stories, but to try to collect the stories of our people as a collective society. In my own lifetime, at this moment in time, for me, the legacy of painting and the tradition of painting that I was seeing in books, you know, that I was examining, or when I went off to the Rhode Island School of Design, it felt like the most natural way of trying to be a part of this sort of lineage. What I wasn't finding was accessibility, obviously, to painters who had a last name like mine. So by the time I got to art school, you know, at RISD, you know, first time out of Texas, and I start making similar images to what you saw a little bit earlier, you know, I began encountering a whole brand new experience of professors, instructors, you know, teachers telling me, you cannot do these kinds of paintings. You cannot tell these kinds of stories. What are you doing? Nobody cares about these stories. Nobody understands these stories. You will never sell a painting. You will never have a career. Well, I had no idea like what they were talking about. I had never been confronted in this way. And you know, as a young student, it really could have broken me. But in an ironic sort of twist of the tale, RISD kept absolutely true to its creed because it lit such a fire under my ass in a way that I was so determined to prove them wrong. Getting out of an institution like RISD, you know, one of the oldest art schools in America, and I returned back home to Texas and began working in the studio. Then I encounter a new sort of, you know, confrontation that I hadn't really experienced before in the art world. I mean, you have to remember that 23 years ago, the art world was a very different place. You know, the painting of the figure like it is now, the portraits, the cultural iconography and symbolism, that was a no-no, right? Then I was an artist of color, so I had strike three. But for me, it was it gave me such a powerful sense of determination to try to excavate these kinds of histories, my own histories, erased histories, histories that America wasn't really, that I felt America really wasn't ready to quite confront or acknowledge yet. And I knew, but I knew what I was up against. I saw sort of this uphill imaginary mountain that I was going to have to slowly figure out and find my way to maneuver around and navigate as a painter. But in the end, for me, after 24 years of making this work, you know, every single day, it is, I've never really abandoned or severed the ties with those original moments early on in life that really kind of gave me the inspiration and the motivation to to depict, you know, as a painter, these kinds of universal tales of the about the human condition.
And what kept you connected to, I guess, that mission? Because I think, you know, 24 years is a long time.
Sure.
You know,
No, it's not.
well, according to Charles, it's a short time. But I mean, you know, when you factor just you know the variables that just go into the artist's journey, just generally, like what kept your eyes on, you know, whatever the prize was for you to keep working through, refining the practice, having understanding the stakes, and understanding that these stories needed to be told, these pictures needed to be made. You know, this reframing and expansion of who can encompass representational art needed to be changed and shifted.
You know, I think first and foremost, it was my own, you know, recognition of the generations that came before me. You know, especially Mexican American Chicano artists like John Valadez, Harry Gamboa. You know, the tradition and the legacy of murals in the American Southwest. But beyond that, you know, I think it really is the idea of the realization that the contributions of many communities within the American infrastructure who have built this country in many ways these stories have yet to be told. I mean, we are in a moment in time when we are witnessing this almost sort of renaissance moment where, there are great earthquake shifts that are under our feet. We're not quite there yet. There's so much more work to be done, but it's a start. In a moment of complete distortion and chaos, if I can create an image and offer the viewer, just for a split second, a moment of clarity and silence, in my own opinion, that is a miniature act of resistance, especially in a moment of urgency like we are witnessing today. For me, that's enough, to carry my community with me, to carry these traditions with me. It's all I need. It's enough for me to get up every morning and then and continue to get into the studio and try to keep pushing forward.
And then, Tala, I wanted to dig a little bit more into. You talked a little bit about the male figures as protagonists in the work. And you said you don't have as many problems as you thought you would have had. But can you talk a little bit about how you landed on that approach? How much of that comes from your experience in Oregon? How much of that is just an assessment and critique of American society? Um, but also, I mean, uh, the power that you have found within kind of using that as a strategy to express ideas, ask questions, give us a laugh through the work.
Yeah, it's so interesting because sitting here, when some of the work has already been done, we can talk with such confidence. Where every day there's like a struggle for finding the faith that will pull you through to the idea and then to finish the idea and to present the idea. So I feel it's so interesting to kind of come in thinking that it was all there, where every day it's actually a kind of a borrowing and a kind of finding the reason, the idea of the idea that any work should be made is only because the artist thinks it should be made, right? Not there is no like reason to be for anything except for that connection between one person and one idea and doing it in a way that connects to some other people. So for me, gosh, yeah, I mean, and also painting is super lonely. Painting is not like the last panel, community building. I mean, some people's paintings are, and I commend them. I'm very jealous of experiences that artists can have that is a bit more collaborative. For painting, for me anyway, so the figurative was also helpful in, like you say, carrying, like for instance, carrying whatever entities or ideas in some kind of a recognizable form into the studio. For me, it was really a negotiation of understanding how I'm perceived as a painter in Europe or in America, because that's where my work was shown most. I've shown some in Iran, but very tangentially. And painting predominantly after 9/11 in the world of Charlie Hebdo and the world of Islamophobia and xenophobia and a kind of caricaturization of the Muslim man, I really felt like I have to take it on head on, and sort of really be a nurturer of this problem in a way that I could hold that image that has become so reduced and then tip it on its head and make it more approachable or comfortable. At the same time, challenge it when I had personal reasons to say, like, you kidding, and because there's machismo, of course, from the culture that I'm also hoping to hold within this context. So I felt a bit like sort of in between a rock and a hard place, where you want to criticize a set of situations that should be criticized. Yet in this context, that paradigm is the underdog within the Western context. So how do you how do you hold both positions, or how do you oscillate or dance with both positions? And that has been the kind of way of playing with those variables in each work, which lands differently every time.
Have you ever felt pressure to lean one way or the other in terms of more non-Western versus like Western, in terms of
My paintings are quite, in their language, are very Western in a way. I mean, I don't use tropes of, I use caricature tropes, which are rather international, you could say, because they're shorthand, because they're done quickly. But I think each painting, depending on the mood of the day, also sits in a different temperament. The problem with again, back to the idea of diaspora, the problem I feel with the holding yourself in a position of diasporic experience is that the diaspora as a group doesn't have an ideology. It's an adjective or something. It doesn't have, so it's not easy to build upon culturally, as opposed to, let's say, the punk movement or this. It doesn't have. It's too open. It's too broad. So I find that has to also be navigated as we want to use it for the seeds and for regrouping and joining voices within a dominant structure. Yeah.
and talking about structure, Charles and Gala, you both think about systems, categorization, record keeping structures within your practice. Um, what is your relationship to this idea of structure, and do you feel it empowers, or do you feel empowered by creating structures or your own structures through your respective practices?
Yeah, I'll get to that answer. I want to piggyback on what you said about the non-ideological framework of the diasporic. And in fact, that's true. And a lot of it has to do with that. It's just a general term. And it encompasses different histories. And most of the time, it focuses around the ethnic identity and the political and social relationship of that identity and their minority status in whatever culture that they're living in from as a consequence of their diasporic dislocation. But in the way I was thinking this issue through, I created this relationship with the diasporic, with the decolonial, and that is ideological. I mean, in fact, it is necessarily ideological, and that comes from that practice is essentially about how do you unpack and dismantle, you know, the, regimes of culture coming from white, from white culture. That how do you dismantle the institutions, or how do you take them over? And it turns out that if you just think about that in terms of a particular political narrative of emancipation, that locks us into a need for some argument for identity, because the notion of an identity allows and helps implement a politics. But it turns out that the position of being individuals in a decolonizing space actually creates huge problems because if you expand beyond just the notion of identity and get into how you can reframe and rethink ideologically the space of life around you and the culture around you, you run into a lot of conflicts and paradoxes. Like, for example, I was on a panel just recently, and Homi Bhabha was saying that, well, decolonization or decolonizing is it's a problematic term because for the most part, what happens is that it's particularly as it played out in Europe and parts of Asia, what happens is that once the Europeans leave, the the once occupied population moves in their place, and it turns out they run it just as badly as the Europeans ran it. So that idea of decolonization is to kick the Europeans out, but it's not a complete decolonization because the previously occupied people are, using the same structures, yeah, and creating, similar problems. So I reflect back on, and this is where I'm getting to the structures. I reflect back upon a show I curated back in '93 called Theater of Refusal. And in Theater of Refusal, what we did was that we studied several black artists, the writings on their work, and because I discovered that the writers who wrote about black artists, they're all almost all white writers. They wrote about the work in marginalizing terms, and this strategy then marginalized the work and marginalized the artists, and it perpetuate the difficulty of those artists getting recognition and getting shows. So I wanted to prove that this was the case by in the show and analyzing the writing about it, and of course we did find all of these quite stereotypical terms about like you're saying they assumed that you couldn't paint. What was that? Yeah, you assumed you didn't do math, right? So there are a lot of assumptions like Basquiat, was just an emotional, force who didn't think, for example. And this, which of course wasn't true, but this writing was going on. So I tried to move that forward to today and think about that idea of marginalization in terms of the decolonial. And found that even in trying to figure out how to unpack the institutions of control from European culture, we ran into all these paradoxes and impossibilities, like the one in government. I mean, the Europeans invented democracy. Other cultures invented other kinds of systems, but we live in a democracy, and as long as we have a democracy, we're being colonized because that's the system we're living in. So, of course, decolonization doesn't mean you got to get rid of all of these systems. And so now I'm going to get to the point.
You're on point.
Yeah. So I thought, in my own practice that by deconstructing systems of representation and deconstructing, sort of ideological frameworks, through, looking at manifestos and discourses, political discourses, and reducing them to their signifying functions or their structures, I could reveal how these structures and functions were actually implanting these ideas, and rather than them being inventions of our imagination. All right, and so in my work I put together things that are unrelated, for example, in the language-based series, but people are compelled to find linkages and relationships, thinking that this was my intention. This reading was my intention, but there's a lot of information in the work that shows you that what I did is work from chance and arbitrariness. And so that hopefully, I was thinking that we can think about how ideology and discourse works. And my idea was that rather than to try to entrench certain concepts of identity, space, place, and location, even though they were quite legitimate, and they were taken away as occupied people, rather than to bring them, just to bring them back or just to give them attention, we have to reinvent ourselves, and the process of reinvention is really the decolonial project, and that is that once you find out that if we move away from a superstructure of colonization, we find ourselves in a very weird and ambiguous space. And rather than to try to nail it down, what we need to do is produce something new as that person.
Yeah, this is the mini revolutions that I was also interested in, as a kind of a personal revolution of my own consciousness. That I thought was a more interesting experience for myself as an artist as well.
Um, yeah, I think that I was thinking about in my own work how to I make, for example, that one drawing that we showed with that, and how there is sort of a receipt of these processes of colonization that have happened, and sort of we don't know because we only see the contemporary version of it. And so if you take a look at this one work that I made, it's essentially just representing what the catalog of a set is. So for example, the last one, there's this last work that I made is 530 national treasures, is the South Korean and North Korean national treasures collated. So in theory, it's just very straightforward, representing what the catalog says. But as the viewer sees it, you might not be able to see it in this detail, but like the first 60 of the objects are all architecture, because the person who was in charge of assigning national treasures was during the Japanese occupation, and he was an architect. And so after Japan left and then the Korea split, then there was a new way of actually picking what these national treasures were, but they never reset the original ones. And so in a way, the complete catalog that we see now doesn't have the sort of nuances to understand how the beginning generation made something, what made the second generation pick something. And so throughout history, all of these different sort of interventions into set that in the contemporary version is just all sort of flattened out. And so through looking at these sets, I think that so much of this additive colonial structures, or not, or what we decide to keep or leave, get still operate in our day-to-day lives, even though they feel like they are not part of it so much. So what I liked about understanding this drawing was that by seeing it, you would be able to recognize how even Japanese occupation is still relevant in today's like set of what people think a treasure might be.
Um, this is for everybody, and I think we've kind of scratched at it. But can we talk a little? I guess drill a little bit more deeper about the artist's role in shaping cultural narratives. You talked about reinvention. In case of your work, reframing. Re-narrativizing. Can you talk a little bit about, from your point of view, the role of the artist in like shaping these narratives, reinventing them, inventing new ones, challenging these norms? Um, so using the practice as a tool to kind of like create some pathway forward, so that we're not necessarily stuck in these boxes or stuck uh, believing these stereotypes that Mexicans can't do math, right? But creating other possibilities for dialogue, discourse, but also understanding, right, of each other. But
For sure. For me, I think one of the most challenging but exciting aspects of being in the studio on a daily basis is trying to navigate to create a situation for myself where I have the ability to really hover in between two worlds, right? Whether that be the world between the United States and whether it's Mexico or any other sort of uh, uh, bordering country. It's also finding a way um, I think reinvention is a key word here for me. I always tried to find a way to challenge myself to reframe and retell these stories in a way that hasn't really quite been seen yet. And so what I mean by this is that I remember, right out of school 20 years ago, sitting in the studio and asking myself, staring at the wall and saying, so what do I do? Where do I go from here? The idea that I came up with at that moment in time was that as I was quickly finding that the phone was only ringing during Hispanic Heritage Month and Day of the Dead, right? From curators and institutions or galleries.
And I'll let you finish your thought, but I just have a question. Did you take those calls, or you were just like,
At first I did because I needed the opportunity.
okay.
I needed to show the work.
Hmm.
But very quickly I started to realize this was a recurring pattern. And that I was going to quickly place myself into a corner, and it was going to be very hard to dig myself out of that hole. And so what I came up with was that I was trying to find a way to take these, whether it be the legacy of painting, it's a very Western, Eurocentric tradition and history, but I wanted to offer the viewer a new way of seeing, a new perspective, something so fresh and compelling in terms of the idea that I could actually begin to dissolve that line, the boundaries between what is past, what is present, what is reality versus myth, what is imagination versus observation. Because I think for me that is how the way that I can best describe my own observations of what life is like in 21st century America, right? We are the United States of amnesia. We learn nothing because we remember nothing. This is where I wanted the work this is what I wanted to generate, to be the catalyst inside of the work, that when you stand in front of these images, all as traditionally or skillfully as they're painted and rendered, there's a kind of new language being born. Because I think this is one of the things that fascinates me most about present day America is not only America's ability to forget and to lie to its own self, but a counter-offensive to this is the idea that America has the ability to regurgitate its own self. It invents its own myths. It's constantly in flux. I wanted to be a head-on collision of both worlds and try to spit this out. And I think that this has been my quest since. And the cinematic sort of scope of and format of these images embodies all of these different ideas, that I encounter out in the world. And I think that without the use of text, without the use of much articulation, other than the imagery and the coded symbolism inside of these images, I think that this is what I am trying to resolve for myself as a painter in the studio.
Any other thoughts?
I mean, if I really think about what you're saying, Larry, I just feel like that work for me actually leaves the studio and turns on me when I'm actually just a citizen. Because I feel so much of that has to actually be rooted, not just for the art public, but in much more through our society, in education, and in young children's education. So that in terms of the amnesia that you're talking about, or in terms of this cultural movement. So I guess for me the paintings are much more of they're for my consciousness to shift. But because I just don't know if the art people who come to art if that's a big enough pool for the kind of cultural shift that I'm interested in seeing. But I might be wrong. I might be cynic on that.
You're absolutely wrong.
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I do it.
No, I'm just kidding. I saw a moment for a little joke. And
I like it.
So
Good one.
But no. I mean, what you're saying is really important. I'm going to suggest that that a lot of us have an idea of art practice that says it's something that sits outside of our general cultural life, and it's a private and personal experience, and that And it is. That's absolutely true. But the idea that it's unrelated to culture is the thing I don't think is true. You know, that relationship of the personal and the social. Yeah. So that, um, and this is what I was saying is that in terms of my own uh, investigation of certain colonial, of the presence, or how do we, where do we, and how do we find the colonial mind in today's culture, and how do we stand outside of it? That the idea I have is that we have to reframe the way we think of the personal subject or the subject. We have to redefine it so that that subject becomes really something that is culturally embedded, so that there is a relationship. And in fact, you have the capacity as the solitary artist to change the narrative in the general culture. You don't know how that narrative is going to change, and you don't even have to think about how it's going to change.
Totally correct.
But the fact is that if there's this understanding that that effect will happen, it will happen. And the only reason why it doesn't happen is because there's this ideology out there that says that art is a wholly personal experience, and it just uh, uh, and except for that moment in exhibition, the experience of producing is not it doesn't have others don't have access to that. I think that is an ideology that controls the minds and thinking of a lot of us. And that's what I say. That's one other area I say that we're all, particularly in that particular perspective on art, we're all subject to the colonized mind.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And if I may, I just wanted to say, I think one of the biggest cultural forces that, I mean, you might disagree with me, that we are in is a kind of, and from different directions, is a push towards conservatism, whether it's social, political, cultural, through the market, through many facets. And I think that's one thing that collectively, doesn't matter which seat you take, I think as artists or culture makers, that if we can move away from that, then you're supporting a shift from that within the collective subconscious. And this is where I think the notion of the diaspora can be a double-edged sword. That if you lean too much into it, you ultimately become conservative in the sense of conserving, in a way that you might really choose that on your conscious mind you might not want to be. You might want to be much more forward jumping, and yet you have this job now. So that's the thing that I think we have to sort of really fine tune ourselves. Yeah.
I think that unless Gala has anything to add, we can open
Well,
up the questions. But Gala,
I think that when I think about the artist job or something, is more to sort of ask questions with the public. Because as Tala said, I think that studio life is very lonely. So, I do think that many of the works that I think about are just questions that I have of existing systems. And I think that the hope is that once an audience understands your position, that we might collectively ask similar things together.
thank you. So we have ushers with mics. Oh, we got questions. Okay. Um, they will come around. Please give us your name. I think it's important that you share your name so we know who we're getting incredible questions from. So, hands up high here in the middle.
Hello, thank you so much for this really incredible and really thought-provoking conversation. Stephanie Reich, in each of your work, it shows personal and political actions against systems that are often oppressive. Have you ever experienced your work and ideas leaping out of the art world and reinventing systems of oppression? I think Tala and Charles, you talked about that a little bit. Or is is your message to, is your job as you see it, if you see it that way, to illuminate these issues? And it's really our job to change the systems that we work within.
Is your question, sorry.
You want to rephrase the question?
Is the question that have we experienced the work actually changing a structure?
Have you yes, have you
Yeah, a
experienced
scenario.
have you experienced your work yet making some influence that causes reinvention?
Maybe it's a particular work or an exhibition.
I mean, I have a funny story, but I don't think it's pertinent. I mean, maybe after you go. In Sweden, some very right-wing politician used one of my paintings to challenge child pornography laws that also like sort of pertain to the written and the drawn. Are there pornography laws is that you can also not draw children naked or something like this? So that's not funny. So it was fun.
I
So
think it's hilarious.
yeah. So at some point, I think before the verdict came, I wasn't supposed to go to Sweden in case the verdict went the other way, and yeah, that was interesting. That was an interesting experience.
The question is too narrowly drawn. Like, for example, I don't think there's going to be a painting that determines that Trump will absolutely lose the election. You know, uh, uh, but this is what I was trying to say in terms of another notion, cultural collectivity. A cultural space, you're operating in a cultural space, the boundaries of which you can't see or determine. But you nevertheless, as an individual, you are an individual because you will have a reverberating impact on that space. So I witnessed how art ushered in the women's movement. I mean, it was art, and I also, and it's the same with a number of these political movements that have to do with dealing with marginalized practice. That the persistence of artists, not just one artist, but it turns out that a lot of artists, and they didn't get together and form a union or anything, except for maybe Judy Chicago. But they were working individually and pounding away their own ideas, and it just so happened as a collective that had an impact. I mean, again, I think there's a myth that the colonized mind suggests that individuals can have no impact. And then they isolate, like art is one of those disciplines that can't have impact on individuals, or they say that there are certain disciplines that shouldn't think about cultural issues, and that's all wrong.
I think that that's a question that feels that is in relationship to a specific time frame. I mean, I think that when the work goes out on view versus when it might have an impact, like you can't anticipate how long that might be. But I think that personally, when I think about the questions that I'm asking with institutions, those ideas were built over centuries of time, and they're not going to take as fast as we would want to be, or even in our lifetime. But when I think about it in relationship to even the questions that are being asked within institutions in the past 10 years, so relative to the whole history of museums or institutions or collections, that's actually very, very fast. And we might not actually see how, like, I might not actually see how specific work impacts something directly while I'm alive, but maybe like 500 years from now, I don't know,
It's all possible. Another question? Where,
I have a question for Charles. You mentioned in the decolonialist project something about democracy also being a colonizing force, and I guess I just wanted more clarity on what you meant about that. Is if it was a suggestion of like some sort of system that would be even more egalitarian, or I think it just comes to sensitivity in our country, current state of how democracy is in some sort of peril. Um, and yeah, part of me immediately thought of sort of like NPR liberalism promises us a gradual but eventual expansion of the charter of democracy, that we will all be included, given greater rights. Or were you? Yeah, I just want to know, like, what is your position more on that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because I don't want to be misinterpreted. What I was saying that democracy as an ideology is a Western ideology. Okay, Europeans dominated its institutions. So just that is to say, is to explain that it's impossible to get from underneath the structural and institutional framework that colonizers produced. It becomes a situation where you have the choice of changing who's in control of that framework, and uh, shifting power. All right. And in my work, I was suggesting that the idea of subjectivity, that art is a subjective practice, is also a product of the colonizer. And so I'm not suggesting that we all suddenly not become, robots. What I'm saying is the extraordinary problem that the decolonization project reveals to us, that it is a huge, difficult task to get underneath or apart from the control and authority of white people. It's just extraordinary. But it's possible. My favorite writer with respect to that is Edward Said, where he changed the entire way literary criticism was written, and the entire way by sort of revealing how literature itself was the colonizing, has served the role of colonizing and oppressing non-European people.
Another question in the front? Or
I wanted to ask a quick question about, in speaking about diaspora, thinking about the future and the current climate crisis and the diaspora that will arise from that. And I wanted to know, I guess it's open-ended to everybody, if you kind of think about that in terms of your work and how working as part of the diaspora will change as more and more groups of people become part of a diaspora, and more than that, groups that are now kind of historically considered different diasporas will be considered one diaspora, i.e., a group of people all having lived in a part of California that is now, underwater, and just thinking about that and long term, but not that long term.
I mean, I couldn't make work with the sort of deep, um, um, the sort of hole that holding that thought would put me in. So it comes out of so when we're there, I think then, for me, I'll think of responses. But I can't imagine that, because I do think that collective subconscious does lend us somewhere. So I do think that if I'm busy with an anxiety, I'll be adding to an anxiety. So I can't, when we are there, I'll deal, but before then, we should just work with trying to make governments make better choices so we don't get there. So you know what I mean, as opposed to already getting the life jackets for then. That I think, no, first let's write the thing so they don't, what I mean, hurt, so yeah, that's where I go.
Any other questions on the right?
Hi, my name is O Stone. I wanted to ask Charles, do you think that revolutionary politics will ever become mainstream? That's something that you actually said in Theater of Refusal. But yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I didn't quite say that way. The but I understand what you're saying. So what I was saying in that essay was that there, if we can get away from having like this binary of mainstream and marginal, like white and black or white and Latino, if we can get away from that margin, that's the difficulty. So for example, in that binary, if there's only two options that the colonial space is provided, that either you're white or you're not white, and that's all there is. So how do you emancipate yourself from that binary is the problem, and that's where I made the argument for sort of a revolutionary politics in our thinking, a constant reevaluation, reconsideration, very much like you were talking about in terms of presenting the narratives, that rather than indulging ourselves in some absolute space, which then traps us back into the binary. And because when we're in the binary, then we're always marginal.
Two more questions. So, ushers, I'll let you choose. The sing lady in the front. Wait, where? I can't see. So,
There are two hands up. Oh. Hello. I was really taken by the word decolonizing, and at the same time, I was thinking about the state of the nation and the incoming elections. And then I started associating the word decolonizing with maybe it's the same thing as woke, and how popular is that in the MAGA world. And at the same time, I'm thinking on the idea whether this conversation is really fantastic. At the same time, I raise the question whether to what extent we're singing to the choir, not necessarily in super high criticism, because it is very complex what is being presented here. And I see sort of a group of the artists are part of this decolonization or a strategy to do that. But I guess the question has a lot to do with the word decolonizing in terms of how can that be presented in a way that is sexy, in the sense that it seduces well beyond the borders of conservative thought. And I just want to see, I don't know if you understand the question, but anyway, I'm throwing that out.
Yeah, well, I'll tackle it first. I think I understand the question. Yeah, well, I mean, the issue with being woke, that's a problem. There was the MAGA right started removing critical theory. What was it? What was that?
critical race
Yeah,
theory.
critical race theory, and and tried to sideline a whole group of a whole discussion about race by calling it critical race theory. And it turns out that what they meant by it has nothing to do with critical race theory. All right, so it's like they created a fiction, and the So critical race theory is a is a sophisticated practice. I guess it began in law schools, and and it has to do with law. I mean, it had a very specific application, not a general critique of the history of race relationships. And the same thing with decoloniality. It's a huge subject, and it's a subject that is undertaken by intellectuals, academics. Uh, there are some academics who, I think Cornell West is one. There's some academics who can take these complex structures and talk to regular people about them. I mean, I don't think I'm not an academic, but I don't think that I'm the one that can do that. But it can be done. So, I mean, to answer your question, making it sexy, yeah. Yeah. So I just don't know who's going to do it yet. But but I just wanted to make sure you know that it's not decolonization is a very sophisticated academic exercise of analysis and and occupying many books, taking a huge part of libraries. And it's very complicated because there are as many concepts, definitions for decolonization as there are minds who undertake the subject.
How much of me is colonized? In that is part of the thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was just trying to talk about how I use the concept and how the impact it has on my work. But you have to get involved in studying it and finding out what it is, so that you can find out whether, because I can't determine that for you, and but I would suggest that you know pick a reader and read, take somebody's position, see what you think of it.
One more here.
I had another one here.
Oh,
No,
sorry.
I just.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Like, I'm not sure if I can make decolonizing sexy, but I think that one of the ways that I thought about it is not to define it as that, just to sort of find the common values that people want, or something that are like muggled down by specific terms. And so when I think about, like, you know, what are the commonalities between conflicting ideas, and I'm thinking about, structures of, like, institution Western institutions of history, period, in relationship to decolonizing ideas. And it's just mostly thinking about, like, what are the common goals? Like, there are some commonalities, but then they get muggled down by these specific terms that are very off-putting, like conservation or decolonizing, these specific things. And so, in a way, to just be like, if we remove the terms, how do we get to the specific, like, future that is a collective imagined, not sort of stifled by the terms conversation.
Which I agree, but I guess that's where language comes into to play.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if you guys ever read Frank Luntz's Words That Work. And he's a Republican strategist, and it's really fascinating where, like, they'll take that word like woke, kind of take it, twist it around, and then they're able to kind of apply it, right? And just kind of generalize. Or, like, I remember Newt Gingrich when he had, like, the contract with America, or, like, death tax. Like, how do you take language and simplify it to where, like, even if you don't have that nuanced understanding, it paints a picture in your head, which may not be an accurate picture, but it paints some kind of picture. So
Yeah, but it's like we're trying to unpack the term diasporic. These aren't simple ideas. And the phenomenon, what happens in American culture often, is to completely redefine a legitimate concept in the world and redefine it in a way that has no resemblance to the original concept for political use. We can't give license to that. We can't allow that. I mean, we simply have to we have to, in every opportunity we can, um, remind ourselves and remind people that of the complexity of the idea. The larger framework is, do we live in a world that had been dominated by Europe for like 2 to 3 centuries? Do we live in that world now? And I know that the Magna Carta says that we don't, but that's silly. We do live in that world. Now, the idea is that if we can recognize that we live in that world, then we can say that we are in a world that is post the post-colonial, or after the post-colonial moment, and that, for me, that would be a big step, because we can say we'll embrace we embrace the idea that that our history of the United States and other cultures was created by the colonial occupation and the imperialist occupation of other people in other lands. If we can all come to that agreement, to me, that's decolonization. Yeah.
Hi. Oh, sorry. May I ask a question? They gave me
Yeah,
the mic.
go ahead.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Prager, and studied with some of you all. There's 3 things that I keep thinking about. So, in terms of diaspora, there's 2 parts of my identity that I hid in particular. One was being Jewish, because I've been pro-Palestine for 20 years. But now, strategically, I say it because it amplifies my ability to speak. The other part of my identity that I hid was being disabled, because that's right, for all the reasons. But then strategically, I started to amplify that as I became a union activist, because it's a tool. It's a tool that allows me to fight and to take action. And for me, I think of this time as a time for action, and I think of art as a tool. And I think we, as artists, have seen it be a tool in our own lives, and in the lives of others, and in the lives of the collective. I think that it is always functioning as a potential tool for self-expression, for the ability to give voice, right, to work through, and then as a tool, potentially, as Charles talked about, right, the women's movement, lots of artists, lots of art. And I don't think that any single individual is going to change everything. But I do think that if art could be conceptualized as a tool, it becomes really powerful in my mind, and it keeps me from giving it up, because it's very hard to be an artist. So I just wonder if any of that resonates with anyone.
Well, I would just only say that it's just so important to understand that the things that one identifies oneself with, if previously the environment made it so that you couldn't be vocal about those categories, but now you find the moment where you can be, that in fact one finds a way of being able to stand for them or with them beyond the moment, right? So that we're not waiting for the environment to be open to us, that you find a way of self-expression or the way of reframing oneself within one's work, so that it's not in the behest of the cyclical interest of the phone calls that come whenever they come or whatever. That's I think the thing for everyone, to find how they can frame themselves for beyond the moment.
I think with that, unless you want to say something. No, you look.
You know what?
Go ahead.
I think what I'm walking away with today is just a reminder. You can't stand neutral on a moving train, as the great Howard Zinn once said. Right? This is the moment. What counts the most is that we have to fight back. I think in the grips of capitalism and the institutions, nothing's going to remain uncompromised. But you have to take a stand. I'll stop there.
With that, thank you, Gala. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Charles. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the AAPI Artist Network, the Here and There, Art Noir, our friends here at the Hammer. Please join us in the lobby of the theater for some coffee, snacks, and we want to keep the conversation going. But thank you again for joining us, and thank you all the panelists. Thanks.